I am so glad you convinced me that the family car should be the Defender 110. It is so beautiful inside, it's so comfortable, and it just feels indestructible.
Yes, it really is. I've been waiting a long time for the new model to come out. The Defender 110, I'm telling you, it's my favorite car of all times. It's my third one. You know, I have stories of going off-road. The guy managed the group. He was like, what are you doing in this beautiful car? I'm like, I'm going off-road. He's like, are you sure? Because you can use one of ours. And then they look like Mad Max cars. I'm like, no, we're going to do this. And he was shocked.
Wow. Well, it's great because the Defender has been reimagined for 21st century adventure, and its unparalleled off-road ability as well as its robust interior are invaluable whether you're headed towards uncharted territory or just a weekend of exploration. The Defender 110 tackles challenging surroundings with absolute confidence. The SUV conveys strength outside and in, featuring peerless technology like an intuitive driver display and an award-winning infotainment system. That's my favorite part, to keep you connected no matter where the journey takes you. Adventure is unique to everyone, and so is the Defender. Choose from the two-door Defender 90, the four-door Defender 110, or the larger Defender 130 with the ability to seat up to 8 passengers. You'll find uncompromising performance in all three. So pack up and go even further with the Defender 110. Learn more at LandRoverUSA.com/Defender. Capella University is rethinking higher education. With its game-changing FlexPath learning format, you can earn your degree on your schedule and fit your education seamlessly into your life. Imagine your future differently at capella.edu.
This isn't your average business podcast, and he's not your average host. This is the James Altucher Show. Today on the James Altucher Show.
We live in a world that's changing so rapidly that even the world's greatest experts in whatever field it is, like their knowledge is getting stale every minute. And so we all have to be just constantly learning and constantly exploring. And that's the way that we're going to stay relevant and involved and engaged in this world that is going to change at a rate that is not only faster than ever before, but will constantly and always be increasing. If you are doing something in good faith and holding yourself to the highest standards and saying, well, if I'm going to make a statement, I better be able to back that statement up. That's the thing.
So, Jamie, we did a great podcast a few weeks ago about your book, Hacking Darwin, which is all about your expertise in genomics and how fast and incredibly things are going to change over the next few... They're even changing right now because of genetic engineering and our studies of genomics, and nobody knows about this. I didn't know about it until I read this book and then spoke to you. But what I'm fascinated about is, who the fuck are you?
I ask myself that same question every morning.
Like, you know, I thought, okay, Hacking Darwin about genomics, is this guy going to be a top MD, PhD who's done all this research? No, I mean, you're very impressive. You were in, you served in the National Security Council, the State Department. You worked for the UN in Cambodia. You wrote a book about Cambodia, which is not at all related to genomics. And you wrote 2 science fiction novels. So, but this book was so comprehensive and explained so simply about genomics and where our understanding is now, what's the technology, and of course, a sign of true knowledge is if you can explain something simply to someone like me. I'm just curious, and this is helpful to anything, if person A wants to learn person B, wants to learn subject B, the standard script is go to school, go to graduate school, work in the industry, do research, be famous. And you said, nah, I'm going to skip the whole entire line, that whole 10,000 hour thing. I don't need to do it. I'm just going to be the world's expert on genomics. And now you give talks on genomics. Where you're going to Geneva to give a talk on genomics, right?
I'm part of the World Health Organization International Advisory Committee.
Why?
And 2 weeks ago, I was at Lawrence Livermore National Lab, which, as you know, is such an important lab in the U.S. Science structure. I gave a major talk hosted by their president to the top scientists at the lab. I speak at medical conventions to hundreds and thousands of doctors. And it's a great question. And the real issue is, how do we learn? How do we know something? And certainly I come from a medical family. Everybody, they actually give me a lot of shit about this. Like, hold on, why are you keynoting these medical conventions? But the fact of the matter is that it's great that we all become specialists. And there's certainly a body of knowledge that people have to master. But you take medicine. People know probably as much as they're ever going to know academically at the moment when they finish their residency. And then for the rest of their career, many decades, they're kind of living off of that body of knowledge. And it's really difficult because you're seeing 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 patients a day. When are you going to devote your time not just to learning the nuts and bolts of what you need to know, but of the big picture? I mean, we are in this incredible age of superconvergence where whatever your field is, it's being touched by so many other fields. In tech, people say, well, you don't even know who your competitors are because don't look at the people in your industry, look at all the people who could disrupt where you are. And so for me, I think the core of expertise is just having an insatiable curiosity. And for me, it was 20 plus years ago when I came to this realization that the genetics and biotech revolutions were going to change the world and change our lives. And I hadn't taken a science class since high school.
So you knew nothing. So first off, just a comment. Yeah. There is some evidence that the longer time has passed since a doctor got his medical degree, chances are the worse medical advice he gives. That's not always true. I don't want to say that about anything specific. It's just kind of generally that seems to be the research shows. And then the other research is to your point, often when you combine ideas from several fields, you get better results. So it sounds like a little bit of the direction where you're going, but where were you 20 years ago what were you doing? You were like working in the Senate Foreign Relations?
No, I was on the U.S. National Security Council. So I was on the NSC. My then boss was this obscure to the outside world White House official named Richard Clark. And Dick was telling anybody who would listen, unfortunately it wasn't enough people weren't listening, or too many people weren't listening, that terrorism was something really big and really important. The United States needed to take this seriously, to go after this group called Al-Qaeda and cut off its head, who was this unknown terrorist named Osama bin Laden. And after 9/11, Dick was this Cassandra. And so he was a Cassandra because he had in many ways predicted the future, and a Cassandra because he hadn't been able to do anything about it. And so Dick always used to say that you need to look around the corners. You need to try to see what are the things that you have the potential to see that other people aren't able to see, because so many of us have the tendency, just to use a kid's soccer analogy, to kind of follow the ball. We see these kids' soccer games, like everybody is bunched around the ball in one corner of the field.
But you have to know a lot. Like a lot of people predict things and are wrong. You have to know a lot and be able to assimilate a lot of knowledge together and a lot of clues together to kind of look around that corner. Like, how did you decide, like what ignited the fire inside of you to do the study of genomics? And then it seems like you have to learn a lot to be an expert enough to be giving talks to the experts at Lawrence Livermore Laboratories, write the book that's the book now for genomics. Like what ignited the fire, and how did you begin the learning process? You quickly learned in a way that completely skipped the rules. You broke the rules.
Yes. So one is you have to be open. And that's one of the expertise is this double-edged sword, because once you think you know, once you think you have the answer, and especially if the answer is part of this established discipline that has been imparted to you, and when you get your degree, whether it's medical school or whatever.
What was your degree in?
My wife had a PhD in history and a law degree. But once it's like what they're wanting to do is to induct you into the guild. And it's great to be in the guild because you learn a lot and you have these very powerful networks. But whether you're in the guild or outside of the guild, in my mind, the way you can see the things that aren't right in front of you is to kind of take a step back and question everything, and even question what is delivered to you as just an absolute truth. And so for me at that time, I was just picking up these little clues. And the way my mind works is I just see a little thing, and then I say, all right, well, what does that mean? And what are the implications? And if this is true, then what? And so I'm just always doing that in life, but I started picking up these little different pieces of clues. And again, this was 20 plus years ago. This was way before the CRISPR-Cas9 system had been developed, and all these miraculous innovations before the first human genome had been sequenced. But there were little cues. And so then, for me, the reason why I think I was able to write a book like this, which is really written for everybody, is I didn't have those shortcuts available to me. So that if you are being trained within some field of expertise, somebody has already figured out some issue and a way of communicating it, and then they're giving you that little piece, and you kind of build that brick, and you're building a wall based on those bricks. Because I didn't really have any of those bricks, I had to construct them for myself. And that meant that to get to the next level, I had to really understand in my own way the foundations. And so now, when I'm communicating them to other people, I've had to understand them the way a regular person would understand them, because that's what I am.
But okay, step number one, I'm gonna just guess. You saw that genomics, the rise in genomics, the power of genomics was increasing exponentially. Just by seeing the dollar amount it cost to sequence the human genome was being cut in half every year.
But this was even before then. So certainly we've seen that. But the sequencing of the first human genome culminated in 2003 and cost $1 billion. When I was starting to think about this was 6 or 7 years before then. And so the process was underway, but most people didn't know about it. So this was even before then.
So what was the thing that let you go? What was the one thing that you were like, okay, this is it?
I can't say that there was one thing, but it was a bunch of little things. And that's why for everybody, I think, we have to be insatiably curious. And even if you're the world's biggest expert in one area, you have to be learning across the fields of knowledge, because that's how we can pick up all these little pieces. But
there's so many things to learn, and there's a lot of things that are boring to people. Everybody has a set of huge amounts of things that are boring to them. So what's step one?
So step one for genomics, or just for learning?
Step one for learning.
Step one is learning is read something boring. And the reason oftentimes boring things are boring, quote unquote boring things are boring to people, is they're frightening. And so our brains just turn off. Like I have this. If I start reading kind of heavy statistics and think, it's hard to weigh in. But boring things become interesting once you know a little bit about them. And so that doesn't mean that no person can understand everything, but in whatever field you're in, you will see little touch points where it's connecting to something else. Like I was up most of the night last night reading about cattle husbandry. And so cattle husbandry, it's like, I come from Kansas City originally. It's traditionally a cow town. I grew up among cows. But I wasn't, when I grew up, I think cow breeding, that doesn't sound something interesting or exciting, so I didn't know that much about it. But now talking about the future of human genetics, if we want to know where our species is going, we should look at how cows are being bred. And so there are like all of these pieces, and once you follow an idea, it will take you to the next place, and you'll come up against a wall, and you'll say, geez, this is something that I don't know about, and I better learn about that. And then you go to that next place, and then there's another wall. And let's say it's cow breeding, and saying, well, I need to understand about the domestication of animals. And then I need to understand, what is the history of human coevolution with animals? And it's just like each thing, it's like a chain reaction, and we need to follow those chains.
Right, so I'm trying to kind of almost formalize it. So it's almost like you have this hub idea, like, you're curious about genomics. What are all the possible topics around this? And then whether it's boring or not, you start reading bits and pieces about them. Like, here's an article, here's a book, here's a scientific paper, and it's almost like this spoke and wheel approach. You have this hub idea that you want to learn more about. Here are all the things connected to it. I'm going to just start learning about them. What's step two? Like, how did you learn the kind of biology, the science of genomics? How did you start that? Because that's very complicated. You didn't know anything about biology.
And so basically, it's as I was saying, you will, when you start doing that, as you move further away from your core, whatever it is, you will bump up against these places where you see, geez, I don't know about that. In order to move forward, I have to know about that. And for most people, you say, well, all right, well, then I'm going to stop right here. But we are incredibly lucky. I mean, we're the luckiest people who've ever lived. If there's anything that you want to learn about, there's an avenue. We're the most connected, most literate. We have access to more information. And it's the same thing. You start simple. Like you start to say, well, I want to understand, whatever the thing is.
Like biology. How did you start? You had to learn biology to learn genomics, right?
Right.
So how did you start learning about biology? Did you get a textbook?
Yeah, So I did get textbooks. I'd taken, not to give Mrs. Mitchell from Kansas City High School 10th grade biology short shrift. So I had that little bit of background. But then you can start small. So let's just say biology. Like if somebody says, well, I feel like I should know more about biology, but I had a bad experience in high school and it's kind of scary for me. Well, what are the different things you can do? You can go to Amazon and they have these books like biology cartoon books. They have little videos of biology made simple. What you kind of have to do is turn the unfamiliar into just remotely familiar. And then that's your new starting point. All right, well, I have this little bit. And then you can kind of keep going further. And so now
was it hard to remember the things you were learning? Because there was a lot of things you had to remember, what a gene is, what a cell is.
Really, don't throw away your old cartoon books. Like even I have those.
But but you're right. There's like biology for dummies. There's biology for kids. There's textbooks. There might be kind of popular science books about biology. So let's say there's 5 or 6 books. There's whatever. So you start reading them. Do you remember them? Do you remember?
I do, but sometimes I need a refresher. And now I'm at this stage where I'm actually spending a lot of time reading really technical scientific research papers. And it's kind of thrilling to be able to read that kind of stuff, to really understand it and to feel like, wow, I got here on my own. And then that's the other thing is confidence. That we are all told to have confidence in your field and don't have confidence when you step outside of your field. And my feeling is, like, you shouldn't have confidence about stuff you don't know at all. But as you learn more, you can have more confidence, and that gives you more courage to go further.
So what was step 3? So you got you kind of gave yourself a refresher course of biology, and because you were able to focus on it rather than a half hour a day in high school, you had this interest kind of fueling, which helps memory when you're actually interested in something. It's probably easier to assimilate and make the connection. Right. What was step 3? What was the next step in your learning?
The next step, once I felt like I understood the principles pretty well, then I melded these new principles that I was learning and the world that I had come from that I knew really well. And that was kind of my entry point into this world, is when I started writing articles for policy journals like Foreign Affairs and others about the intersection of biology, my new world, and national security.
Like, what was your first article intersecting these two things?
So
again, it's this intersection of where you put your 10,000 hours in. Exactly. Now you have 100 hours in biology.
Well, no, it's more than 100. But my 10,000 were in national security. That was my background. I had more than 100, less than 10,000. And so then I put those together, and then I started writing articles. Like I had a piece in 2007 that came out in the journal Democracy, and I felt like I was saying something that was really new because it was like chocolate and peanut butter. The national security people didn't know biology, and the biology people didn't know national security. And so now I had forged this new place for myself. And that was when I had this incredible moment that Brad Sherman, who was then and still is a congressman, and was then chairman of a subcommittee of the House International Relations Committee, he just called me up on my phone and said, hey, I just read this article. This is really important. No one's talking about it. I want to do congressional hearings based on your article. Will you be the lead witness and help me organize the hearing? And so then, like, I'd come from this world that I knew, this world that I was beginning to know, and I created in many ways, this new place. And that
What was
my
the paper
place.
about?
It was about the national security implications of the biotech and genetics revolutions.
And what was your conclusion?
That it was going to have huge implications, that we needed to recognize that this revolution was going to fundamentally transform the context of global power, which is what is happening now, and that we need to start planning for that.
So this is fascinating. So you had these two areas that were completely different: national security and biology. Nobody had really looked or explored the intersection before, probably because biologists stay in their room,
Right.
national security guys stay in their room. You were probably above average in national security, probably below average in biology.
Yeah.
But when you intersected them and wrote in a prominent journal, you were probably the best in the world or close to it at the intersection. So that's why the national security advisor of the country
Right.
calls you,
Right.
because he doesn't have anyone else to call. No one else is in the intersection. You went to the place least crowded.
Yeah, and it wasn't, I went to a place that was least crowded, but that wasn't the strategy. The strategy was, there's this world that I know, this world that I don't know, and really important things are happening at those intersections. And then it comes back to our conversation about expertise. If you are in a domain of expertise and there are lots of people standing where you're standing, you really, it's hard to do something that's really new. You can be great at that thing, but it's at these intersections, and there are all kinds of intersections in life that we can really make new discoveries and new contributions. And that's frankly how so many things move forward, that there are insights about everything embedded in everything else. And I think part of our mission of being thinking human beings is looking with as broadly as we possibly can and trying to make these kinds of connections.
So like if you've advanced far in a career but not as far, like you feel yourself hitting a little bit of a wall or the acceleration slowing, start reading other areas that interest you, because there's always going to be some way to connect the dots, to find that intersection where you could be not necessarily special, but where you have something to say. And then it's important, I think it's really important to note that you did something. You didn't just think about it. You didn't just talk about it in a cocktail party. You actually you thought enough about it that you were able to write something that was publishable in some journal that was then read by, top ranked people. And then, okay, what's the next step? Because then there's still a lot of knowledge of genomics.
So these two principles that got to that point. One is that we all need to kind of think like jazz musicians. And when we're trained in our disciplines, we're thinking like classical musicians. And with classical musicians, the notes are there, and you can do a great job of playing those notes. But with jazz, the notes are there. There is a composition. But you need to kind of find the place, find your own voice, and find your own play. And the second thing is you need to have confidence to go there. I mean, there are lots of people who are classical musicians who are, I'm sure, thinking, well, I guess I could do something different, but you're within those boundaries. And so you just need to have the confidence to take that risk. And so many people ask this question, like, who am I? Who am I to do something that's new or at this seam or this intersection? And I just think that those kinds of risks, those are things that can change people's lives.
Well, actually, the music example is great, because if you think of every great musical group, they're usually intersecting other styles. Like Rolling Stones intersected the new form of rock and roll with the blues from the 40s and created their very unique sound. And you see this all the time in hip hop music. You take take some old song, throw in a hip hop beat and have someone rapping over it, and you've got this amazing intersection. The Fugees had a song, "Staying Alive," I forget the exact title, but they took the Bee Gees' "Staying Alive," put a hip hop beat to it, Lauryn Hill and Wyclef rapping over it, and boom, it's guaranteed to be a number one hit.
Yeah.
Okay, so what was the next step in learning? You're still on your path to being the world's genomics expert without any education at all.
Yeah, I have education. I don't have formal education. So then the testimony, I'm writing more articles, I'm speaking a lot, I'm testifying before Congress, and now I have this platform.
Did you get pushback from other biologists and genomicists?
No, only from my brothers who are physicians. They're like, why are you testifying before
But
Congress?
nobody saw you testifying for Congress and was like, hey, I'm a professor at Harvard on this. Why am I
No,
not?
but the thing is, how could they? Because let's say you're a professor of biology, what do you know about national security? And let's say you're a professor of international affairs, by and large, what do you know about biology? And that was the point of having this intersection. All right, so but now this was 2000. Let's say we're in 2008. So I start to have this platform. I'm still as I always am in this process of learning. And then I had kind of different paths that I could go. One was to say, well, I'm on this path of this intersection of biology and national security. And I thought about this. I was actually approached by an agent after I testified. I said, well, let's do a book on the intersection of biology and national security. And I thought about that. I even started to put a proposal together to write that book. But then I had a really it was an important turning point for me, because in my first book that I'd written had been a history of the Cambodian genocide. And after writing that book, which was a revision of my PhD dissertation, it was kind of important but inaccessible. So my second book was my novel, The Depths of the Sea, which told the story of the Cambodian genocide, but as a story with characters and in a thriller in some ways. And so now I thought, rather than just go down this path of writing a nonfiction, at that point it would have been a lot drier than this book. I wanted to kind of bring people into the story. And so that was why I wrote my two sci-fi novels, Genesis Code and Eternal Sonata. Again, it was taking this nonfiction content, but saying, well, what's a way that I can bring my unique voice to this? And so when I was writing sci-fi novels, nobody could say, well, you don't have a PhD in biology, or, I guess I had the background in national security. And they couldn't say you're not a novelist because I'd already written.
Okay, well, let me answer this. So you're intersecting now with another thing, which is writing fiction, which is not an easy skill either. You can't just say, well, then I wrote and published a novel. Millions of people try to do that and fail. How did you learn to write a novel? Like, a lot of people sometimes write about a topic and then forget all about plot, character development, making it exciting, having cliffhangers. Like, how did you learn to write a novel? And it can't be just you read a lot of novels. Like, how did you actually learn to write a novel?
No, it's a great question. So I have to go back a little bit. So after I started my PhD at Oxford, I left for 2 years to work with the UN in Cambodia as a human rights officer. When I was in Cambodia, this was just the end of the Civil War. I was this young kid from Kansas City. I saw all kinds of really kind of crazy stuff, tons of political murders, ethnic massacres.
You would see the political murders?
I didn't see them happening, but I would be like, that was my job. We'd fly in a helicopter a few hours later, and there would be, these mass casualties. That was our job, was to try to figure out how the UN could respond to this terrible violence. And it was really incredibly traumatic for me. I didn't have the language then, but I think after 2 years, when I went back to Oxford to finish my PhD, I feel like I had something, I wouldn't label it this, but on the spectrum of PTSD. It was kind of just my normal. When I went back to this other world, my normal just seemed like, wow, that's not normal. That's kind of terrifying. So I finished my PhD and was very focused on that, but I realized there was all this emotional residue that I hadn't gotten it out, and the PhD is very structured. And I realized that what I wanted to do was write a novel. And so I knew the content. It was fictional characters, and I came up with the story, but then I didn't know how to really structure or write a novel. And so then what I started doing, so at that point, for a summer, I was working for Mel Carnahan, who was then, unfortunately now deceased, the governor of Missouri. And my parents were in Kansas City, and I was driving back and forth to Jefferson City. And I would check out these Clive Cussler novels on audio tape from the Jefferson City, Missouri Public Library, and I listened to just all of these Clive Cussler novels, and they're fun novels, but just the way that he structured those novels, I really learned a lot from. This
So you listened / read to a bunch of best-selling
Yes.
novels, as opposed to like Ernest Hemingway, who is very literary and a great writer, but might not be he's not going to have a cliffhanger at the end of every chapter. He's not writing thrillers. You wanted to specifically write something people would buy, so you read, let's say, 20 plus thrillers. And how did you break apart the structure? Like, how did you analyze the structure?
So
what were the things you noticed about a typical Clive Cussler novel?
Yeah. So because what I then and even now normally read, left to my own devices, I read nonfiction and literature. I don't read that many thrillers. I don't read that many. Once in a while, and I read them, enjoy them. Kind of what are like beach novels.
So and these were like you were just like focused.
My
like you're
mission,
gonna.
How are you doing it? Like if you're the country's best-selling thriller writer, how are you doing it? And it was really useful because the way that he was doing it was that there was a story, and then he broke down the story into chapters, where each chapter was written from the perspective of a different character. And it was a way to kind of build suspense because you go like, who knew what, when. And it was like a jigsaw puzzle. And for me, the way my mind works, I mean, I'm always trying to like decipher puzzles. And so then I kind of mapped out what I thought that puzzle would look like. And then once I did that, then it was broken into chunks, which I guess is another lesson, that you can't kind of swallow the ocean in one gulp, but you can swallow, you probably shouldn't do it, there's a bad metaphor, but you can swallow a little bit of salt water and it won't kill you. And so then I kind of broke it down into these chapters, and then I got rolling. And I guess the other thing is, especially when you're starting out something, your first draft is probably going to suck. Right. Kind of everything, and especially if you're coming from the outside. But you can't get discouraged. You just need to keep at it. So with that novel, I just kept revising, and then I thought, well, I guess I should try to get an agent now. And I reached out to there was like a little book, writers and editors, and they had a list of agents. And I read it.
But wait, before that though, just in terms of again, figuring out what the structure of a good novel is. Okay, a bunch of characters know different pieces of information. How did he structure a plot so that it would be a thriller? Yeah. Like, how did did you get a sense that he outlined?
Yeah, I did.
Was there cliffhangers at the end of each chapter?
Yes, mapped it out. Cliffhangers at the end of each chapter. You start out with something that really gets your attention, and in my case, it's a dead body, but just some kind of new thing.
So how far from the first sentence was the first dead body in your
so in Genesis Code, so in The Depths of the Sea, which was my Cambodia novel, in the first few pages, there's a murder, and then everything, and then the story starts at a different time that you don't know where it's leading, but it's leading to that murder. In Genesis Code, the body the first chapter starts with a dead body, and in Eternal Sonata, the first chapter starts with this demented geriatric scientist who's disappeared from an old age home in Kansas City.
Okay, so right away you get people going with some high stakes moments,
right?
And then is there a cliffhanger? Like, how is there a cliffhanger at the end of each chapter? Like, how do you get people continuing? Did you follow the arc of the hero? Were you aware of that?
Yeah, so I mean, we're all kind of aware of the arc of the hero because it's been fed to us through Joseph Campbell into Star Wars. So kind of everybody has internalized that, and because of me, because I'm kind of an internal person, I like to think of the internal narratives of each character, like what's driving them, how are they feeling, what are their emotions, and it has to be, for these kinds of thrillers, it has to drive towards some action.
So for every action that happened, you had to make sure at least you were aware what are the emotions of the characters and how that can be expressed in what they're doing.
Yeah, and you had to inhabit those characters enough so that it would allow them to surprise you.
Each character had to have their why.
Yes.
On each page.
Yeah.
And then did you have a sense of, okay, here's the different points I need to reach, and then you would reach them?
I did have that sense. Sometimes I would reach them. Sometimes these characters, who were all obviously versions of me or my projections, would wind up in other places. And then I have to go back. It's like, oh, geez, this happened. How do we move the pieces around? So it was very much like there was an outline for sure, but then strange things happened. And I think that with this kind of novel writing, you kind of have to let go a little bit.
Right, because if you don't surprise yourself, it's going to be hard to surprise the reader.
Yeah.
Like if it's too easy for you to just plot it out, they're going to be able to predict what's happening.
Right.
So you kind of have to surprise yourself sometimes.
Yeah, surprise yourself.
Like just like at the end of a chapter, and then he died.
And it's like in all of life, you have to be open to surprises. And even in a world that you've created, it's like you set these characters in motion. And it's impossible to know in the beginning exactly how they might interact, and just kind of have that openness, and then allow yourself to shift, which kind of comes back to our original thing, is that when you're learning in a new space, your path is not known, and that's what's so exciting about it. And it's scary, and it probably means that you'll bump into more dead ends than people who are just working inside of a discipline, because inside of a discipline, the dead ends have already been identified. And so, when you're 3 steps in the direction of the cul-de-sac, someone will say, oh no, that's a known cul-de-sac, go the other way.
Right, so as you're intersecting, national security, biology, science fiction, you're in a sense, you're really creating your own genre, your own field, the art of science fiction, genomic, national security writing.
Yeah, and
you're going to hit dead ends.
And and everybody has it. So I was writing these novels, and I couldn't have written this book, Hacking Darwin, if I hadn't been a novelist first on this topic. Because then, when I was having to think about this science, and think about its human applications and implications, that was a very different way of thinking about science than just through the science. Then just say, all right, here's the science, what does it mean? It was like, well, if I'm imagining myself as a character interacting with this science, what does it mean for me?
So you had to do a lot more research into the science.
Yeah, of course.
Because now you're that character, it's like you're getting personally involved in the science. You're not just writing it from a policy point of view.
Exactly. And because I had to understand it in my way, and then I had to translate it into novels where there was very real science, but so subtle, or trying to be so subtle, that the reader doesn't get to this point. It's like, oh shit, like now here's the science, and now I'm bored, or get frightened of it. Because I have friends in Washington who also have written novels, and I like the best Washington novels are novels. The worst of them are policy memos with a sex scene thrown in.
Right. Like I sort of feel like a lot of bad novels are, I want to say something about climate change. They write a novel and there's just no good story there.
Yeah,
it's just the world's exploding and someone has to save it, and they don't have any emotional baggage or whatever.
Yeah, and so with me, I needed to sneak in the science so that people wouldn't feel like, oh, the story is stopped. But enough so that people could, when they got to these critical parts of the story, they could understand how they got there, and whether it was the science of human genetic engineering or the science of life extension. And so that was this tricky part, but it forced me to really think about not just understanding science, but understanding the science well enough so that I could communicate it simply. Whenever I meet experts and they're communicating things to me and it's full of jargon, I have less respect for that, because I think the people who I meet who are the greatest experts, the way I define it, the people who can understand all of that jargon, but they've found, I think it's Jim Collins, the simplicity on the other side of complexity, because to be able to communicate, and especially with this revolutionary science that's going to change all of our lives, I mean, it's pretty important that we all be part of the conversation.
So you have, this core hub of genomics is going to be big. So now you got to learn about biology, but you learned it to the extent that, it's really important to do something. So you learned it enough and you were able to explain it enough that you took your experience at national security and wrote a publishable paper. Then you had to understand it enough to be able to testify in front of Congress, which is scary because it's not just this static paper. You have to prepare for questions that these senators are going to ask. And so you have to be able to respond and not seem like a fool. And you have to be able to kind of talk to the National Security Council, whatever. And then you had to learn it to the extent that you could then write about it in a novel. So all these requires different types of learning and studying and nervousness. And what's the next step?
Yes. Anyway, the next step was when I was on my book tours for the novels, and I would just explain the science to people in my way, which is because I had to fight to understand it in these simple terms. I saw people's eyes that they were suddenly realizing the story, that they heard the words, but they were so afraid that when they heard the word genetics or DNA or IVF or PGD or whatever, it just sounded like scary science. But when I communicated it as not scary science, it's just like it's part of a story. It's the story of us. It brought them into the conversation. And that was when I realized that I needed to write this book, which told it's the greatest story of our lives and of all time, the story of us. But I needed to tell it in a way that was accessible to people.
But also, when we talked previously about the book, you've talked to many scientists, also, like now the world's greatest genomicists have spoken to you.
Right.
That also seems to be a critical way to learn. You know,
Huge.
now that you've explained it to senators and you've explained it to the masses through a novel, to write this book, you also needed to kind of, where's the cutting edge? Where are we? So you had to call the George Churches, you know, the greatest genomicists around. You had to call these people. How did you call them, get them to talk to you, know what to ask?
I know them all, or not all, I know lots of them because I've been in this world. I mean, for years I've been speaking at the genetics conferences. So George is a great example. I mean, he's our living Charles Darwin geneticist at Harvard. And he and I have done events together for years.
And why, again, he respects you, from what you said earlier, he respects you because you're bringing in this national security viewpoint and you're able to describe your importance to him by saying, hey, the world needs to know about this. I've got this connection, you know, I'm this tunnel into the government, you know, that you don't necessarily have.
But I wouldn't say that. It's not that. It's
because he still has to respect you before he's going to teach you.
And so there's a few things. One, I mean, George and we do a lot of speaking alongside one another. And he always says that the way he does his work is he reads science fiction novels like mine and then thinks, oh, that's pretty cool. How might we do that? And I always say, you know, I read papers coming out of labs like George's and I think, wow, that's pretty cool. What are the long-term implications of that? So that was probably the start of that and other relationships. But certainly with this book and even the work that I was doing before then, what I'm trying to do is two things. One is to imagine the implications of this science, because the scientists themselves, they're actually doing the lab work. I don't do the lab work. But it's very rare. I mean, George is a great example of someone who does this, but most scientists don't have the time or the inclination or the background to think about what are the big picture implications of their work. I was in Kyoto a few months ago and I was in one of the world's leading stem cell labs, and I was meeting with 5 or 6 of the top postdocs, and I asked 2 questions. It went around at this lunch. I said, first, tell me about the work that you're doing now, and second, tell me what you think are the implications of this work for 50 years from now. Question 1, everybody, there was so much energy and excitement. Question 2, they would like hold on to the table and like they couldn't answer because that wasn't who they were. So what I was doing was imagining helping them imagine and just imagining on my own, what are the implications of this work? Because that's really important. And then communicating that to the public in a way that people could absorb. And scientists are terrible at that.
So in some ways, and a lot of this is about bringing the target closer so you can hit the bullseye.
Right.
So, okay, when you first get interested in genomics, you're not going to just suddenly stop speaking about it until you get a PhD and do lab work. You're going to bring the bullseye really close. You're going to learn enough so that you can write a paper in a national security journal. So you don't need to know the full foundations of genomics. Then, okay, you're going to bring the bullseye closer again, but you're going to learn more. You're going to do it in a science fiction novel context. Now that has a romantic sound to it, so now all these genomicists are saying, oh, okay, he understands it enough to write a science fiction novel. That's neat. I will talk to him. And then even then, you're bringing the bullseye close as they explain to you what the implications are. Maybe they can't understand it 50 years from now because that's not their training, so you bring it closer and closer so they can't explain 1 year from now, this is what could happen. This might be their next research. And then you're again using this intersections to assimilate it all and then write this book.
Yeah, and the thing is like you should put the bullseye as far from you as you can, where you have the possibility of reaching it. Like do hard things as hard as you can do, but if the bullseye is too far and you're just kind of shooting your arrows into the mud, what's the point?
Right, like if you had asked people, what's the implications of this 500 years from now, it almost doesn't make sense. So it might even not make sense for you to think that way. So you're bringing the bullseye close enough where you could make that leap and start guessing, and then you try to say, okay, well, what knowledge do I need to understand what I'm guessing?
Yeah, and you have, even if you're making a guess, and everything that we're doing, anticipating the future, is in some ways a guess, you have to be able to defend it. And you have to be able to defend it in front of all kinds of people. So this book, I mean, certainly I'm thrilled that all kinds of people are reading it, but among them are the world's greatest geneticists and others and scientists. And so this is a book that needs to work for high school kids, and it needs to work for the world's greatest experts. And I'm happy to say that is what's happening. And what I'm hearing from the scientists and the doctors is that most of them weren't able to have this kind of big picture perspective because it's not what they do.
Right, and also getting a PhD, you're forced to specialize into such minutia. It might not even be useful, but it gets you the PhD. So
and it may be useful for doing lab work on that or even in an adjacent area, but it's not useful for imagining what are the big picture implications of your work.
So it's really interesting because, like you said, you haven't done the lab work, but the lab work creates the bricks. And with the bricks, you could build the house. So like imagine if you were to start afresh and you wanted to learn quantum mechanics. Okay, it's the same thing. You're not going to necessarily know every physics equation and 12 years of calculus and everything like that. But okay, here's what happens with two particles that do this and that. Now you might have a guess. Oh, does this mean time travel is possible? Does this mean faster than light travel is possible? And so you can start learning. Maybe you could start reading pop physics books. Maybe then you could write, what does quantum mechanics mean? What are the 10 implications for quantum mechanics in national security? You can pick one, do enough research to write the paper, maybe interview people. You can write the science fiction novel or do some other way, like explain to kids, here's how time travel would work in quantum mechanics, or here's how a quantum mechanics bomb would work, or whatever. And then it brings you full circle to the experts, like, hey, I'm not getting in the way of what you're doing. I'm talking about a science fiction novel with quantum mechanics time travel. Let's, compare notes. And now you know enough to talk intelligently about it. And it just sort of builds and builds.
And as you go along this path, you realize there are things that everyone will have gaps, things that you need to learn. You need to be learning, just being really honest with yourself. Here's what I know. Here's what I need to know. You need to be constantly learning and exploring. You need to be constantly looking for other fields because if you're in these conversations and you're able to bring, let's say the world's leading geneticists, they aren't experts in all these other fields that are relevant to genetics. They may not be experts in AI or big data analytics or music or whatever. I mean, there are a lot of things that can be brought together. And I think that's the goal. So it's like this process. It's this virtuous cycle. The more that you do, the more interesting it is, the more engaged you are, the bigger set of relationships that you have that can help you do it, and the more impactful your work. And so it's almost like building a pontoon bridge, and it's like little segment by little segment. And if you say, oh shit, I have to build like a traditional bridge, and I'm on this side of the river, it's like, well, how am I possibly going to do that? But a pontoon bridge, you just kind of keep adding to it.
You kind of create your own bridge made out of different materials from your own life, and that you pull in.
And it may not be like the perfect bridge. And when people look at it, they may say, well, that bridge looks like kind of a mishmash, because where I come from, we just get the prefab pieces of the pontoon bridge and we just put them and we go across the bridge. And what I would say is, well, that's one bridge and that will get you across the river in one way. But my bridge is a different kind of bridge and it's going to get me across the river in a different way. And when I get there, I'll be in a different place.
Well, like you said, there's many dead ends, but because people in the field have they taught how to avoid they're taught how to avoid the dead ends. You've probably encountered some dead ends.
Yeah.
So I'll ask this final question. At what point during this whole, you becoming essentially one of the world's experts on explaining this very incredibly complicated field, at what point did you most make a fool out of yourself?
It's a great question. And the answer is probably the entire way. And just in the sense that a lot of people, my brothers, first among them, has always said, what you started, who the fuck are you? Like, why are you here?
Why is the Senate calling you?
Yeah, exactly.
They should call me.
No, exactly. And the thing is, that question, you just have to get it out of your, we all have to get it out of our system, because like, we're just here and everybody is contributing. And if you are doing something in good faith and holding yourself to the highest standards and saying, well, if I'm going to make a statement, I better be able to back that statement up. That's the thing. But
then also you have to be creative about what statements you're going to make, and you have to know enough to make those statements.
Yes.
You always have to start with that. It seems like there's a 1-2 process in the very beginning, which is, what's exciting me and how can I learn the basics? The cement has been poured, the bricks have been built, but how can I at least learn the bricks and how to start building a wall?
And be open in the what's exciting me. You have to don't have like a fixed membrane around that. So there's what's exciting me now. But that's going to change as you learn more. Stuff that seemed boring will become exciting, because everything is exciting. Knowledge is exciting, learning is exciting, and it's all interesting once you kind of are just able to look at things from their own terms. I think that's the goal, and we live in a world that's changing so rapidly that even the world's greatest experts in whatever field it is, like, their knowledge is getting stale every minute. And so we all have to be just constantly learning and constantly exploring, and that's the way that we're going to stay relevant and involved and engaged in this world that is going to change at a rate that is not only faster than ever before, but will constantly and always be increasing.
So what are 3 recent books you've read where you feel you've learned the most, where you feel like, my knowledge, I feel like my IQ just went up because I read this book?
Yeah. So one book that I just read that I absolutely loved, by really one of my favorite novelists, is called Orfeo by Richard Powers. And Richard, actually, he just won the Pulitzer this year, but he's written 12 other books, and just such an incredible, wonderful genius. So I certainly...
What did you learn?
I didn't learn about science. I learned about the human condition. And so it's this wonderful story of this guy in his 70s who's a retired composer, but he becomes obsessed with biology because he sees like this ultimate form of composition in biology, and he creates this lab to explore the limits of biology. But then he's accused of being part of this terrorist plot, and so he basically goes on this trip across the country to kind of go actually and visit his daughter. But while he does, he kind of revisits the story of his life. And so I just really, for me, just like science, it's the world of science, but the real implication of science, or what does it mean for us? And that's not just on a scientific level, it's also on an emotional level.
Okay, Orfeo, book number 2.
The second, The Earth Shall Weep, which is a history of Native Americans. And it's so, everybody living in this country, like we are living in this land that was populated by these people who are ancestors, and my ancestors, weren't pilgrims, but we all have a collective responsibility. We just decimated them. And it's just so unimaginable that this crime has been committed in our name. And it's been done so severely that we don't even have to face it every day.
It's interesting because, again, history is written by the victors, right? So I was researching something else, and I read something the other day that surprised me. The largest mass legal execution in U.S. history was in 1862. Lincoln ordered the execution of all of these South Dakotan, I guess, Sioux Indians. I forget how many, but it was the largest one. And it's right at the spot really where Mount Rushmore is now carved with Lincoln's face in it. And we would never be taught that at all in history books.
It's so terrible. And then for the third one, and then I need to go because I'm getting picked up by and I'm really late for my CNN car, which is the third one very quickly is called We Contain Multitudes by Ed Young, which is the story of the microbiome. And it's such a great book and really fascinating.
Excellent. Learning how to learn. Thanks so much, Jamie.
All right, thanks,
See you
James.
later.
My pleasure. All right, see
Go
you.
to CNN.
Okay.
These days, we're all investors, trying to be smart with our money despite our worst impulses. But at iShares, we believe that deep down inside of every investor is a better investor. One that's just waiting to be let out. Explore iShares ETFs and insights and let your best investor out. Visit iShares.com for more information.